In preparation for today's service, I've been having a little bit of a root in my shed, and I managed to find a box of weed killer. Now, let me assure you that we haven't signed some sponsorship deal with any well-known manufacturer of horticultural products. Future weekly services will not be brought to you by virtue of any such organisations, and this is not some clever product placement. Other weed killers are available. But as I look at it and as I think about it, it does strike me that weed killer is actually something of a misnomer, because this is not actually weed killer at all. It's actually just a pretty indiscriminate plant killer. It becomes weed killer by virtue of the plants that I choose to put it on. It's only weed killer if it lands on weeds. And it's that principle, it's that reality, or perhaps the reverse of that principle, that lies behind our gospel reading today. The story of the weeds growing in the field. Jesus tells this story about a farmer who is confronted with an infestation of weeds and compares the whole experience to the kingdom of God. When the worldwide pandemic first broke out, I was intrigued by a relatively small number, but nonetheless prominent number of voices who began to argue that somehow Christian faith was going to provide some kind of immunity to this disease, as though Jesus had somehow promised that being his follower came with its own exemption from all the troubles and the struggles of the world around us. And I'm intrigued actually as to where such ideas come from, because this is one of a number of places where Jesus makes it very clear that this is far from the case. And as I've said on more than one occasion before, the central symbol of our faith is a cross, a symbol of the very real oppression and suffering that confronted the early believers, and a sign of a God who overcomes the toils and tribulations of this world, certainly not by avoiding them. Now, such realities will inevitably generate their own questions, and it seems to me that in this parable, Jesus is responding to the heart cry of generations that have gone before and generations that have followed since. Why do bad things happen in the world? And this is a heart cry that we hear repeatedly expressed by the psalm writers. Why do those who do us harm prosper? And I've got to be honest, I'm not quite sure why those who set up the lectionary and landed on Psalm 139 as another of the readings for today, then omitted what it seems to me are the most relevant verses when it comes to connecting this to the gospel reading. For yes, it is a beautiful and eloquent celebration of human life. Lord, you made me, you know me, there is nowhere I can escape from your love and your presence. But then right in the middle of this eloquent poem comes this jarring reality. I am surrounded by threats and adversaries. I'm confronted by those who speak ill of your name. So if I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, if there is nowhere I can flee from your presence, then how come I'm surrounded by those that I describe as bloodthirsty? How come you're not doing something about them? And then again and again we hear this in the Psalm 42 verse 9. I say to God my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by the enemy? Psalm 6 verse 3, my soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord? How long? Psalm 94, how long will the wicked be jubilant? And again we could repeat phrases like that. Like I said, this is a heart cry that echoes through generations of God's people, and this parable forms part of God's answer, because here Jesus is seeking to explain something of the reality of his kingdom. And as he says time and time again, his kingdom is not of this world. It is not some kind of safe haven to which we can all flee and escape every trial and tribulation that life might otherwise throw our way. The kingdom of God is not a place or some earthly realm. It is a way of belonging, a way of understanding that enables us to live in the midst of reality, but with a sense of a whole different narrative unfolding around us. It is to know that we belong to eternity, to know we have an inheritance and an identity that is unassailable by any earthly force or experience. Just like that crop could not ultimately be ruined by the harmful intent of the weed planter. And it's an invitation to live our lives in the light of that assurance and perspective. And so this story is one of a whole raft of illustrations that help us to work out what kind of life perspective that might be. And as we look at it together, and as we seek to understand a little more about God's kingdom through it, I want to suggest that it offers us three perspectives on how we might live out that calling to be a kingdom people. First of all, we are called to be a patient people. God's kingdom is coming, but it has not yet fully come. And this crop field illustrates that. The kingdom of God is here, just like the rightful harvest was there in that field. But the kingdom of God is coming in the midst of a world where other kingdoms yet prevail, like the weeds that have been deliberately planted. And to some degree, we have therefore to accept that there will be forces at work in this world that are not yet fully defeated, whose impact and influence may well concern or even harm us. But God's kingdom is here, but they are here too. They are doomed, but they are not yet defeated. But I think it's really important that we recognize through the words of this story that Jesus said the world would be so. So if we're struggling, if we do see things happening around us that cause us despair and distress, God has not let us down. Our faith has not somehow failed. This is how Jesus said it would be. And Jesus uses a very simple illustration from everyday life to underline that reality. Many of you people, he says to the crowd that he's speaking to, you work in agriculture. You know the frustration of planting a good crop and then discovering that it's infested with weeds. And you know that you can't do anything about it immediately, because pulling out the weeds, you're likely to uproot the intended crop and lose the lot. Like I said, it's the same issue as with my garden weed killer. I can't just spray it over a flower bed and hope it picks all the weeds out and leaves the flowers and the border plants unaffected. If I try to take the weeds out, I'll lose the lot. And there's an added frustration in this story that it wasn't even an accident, it was deliberate. And again, you can sense that Jesus is hearing that heart cry of the psalm writer. It's bad enough suffering trial and tribulation, but when you know it's being deliberately inflicted on you by those who mean you harm, that just adds to your woes. Now, as I often stress, the parables of Jesus are not intended as instructions for everyday life. They are illustrations. They're offered as pictures to help us better understand these big issues. So no, scores of farmers did not immediately go running from Jesus' teaching sessions to cancel their latest weed clearing operations. They already knew that that was reality. But Jesus uses that reality to say to us, you know how that feels. And you can imagine how you might act if you were in charge of that situation. You can understand why a farmer confronted with this might act in the way that I have described. So on that basis, trust that God is not overwhelmed by such realities on the cosmic scale in which God's purposes operate. You can trust God, even if you can't understand. And on that basis, if you feel that God is not doing anything about it, if you find yourself asking those questions like the ones that the psalm writer asks, you can be assured that this is not a sign that God is absent. It is not a sign that God does not care. It is simply a sign that the day of God's resolution of things has not yet arrived. And we might also find the capacity to be patient by recognizing the limitations of parables. This is a parable. It's illustrating a point, not prescribing reality. So of course, we're not a crop of wheat, and the forces of evil that cause us harm are not weeds that can't be removed. And so, at another level, God is not restricted by the same realities that confronted this farmer. But maybe part of the reason that we're called to be patient is because this is also a sign that God is being patient with us. If only you would slay the wicked, says the psalm writer, and you can understand why they feel that way. But who gets to decide who is wicked and who isn't? What is the threshold of wickedness that we expect God to tolerate before he begins to zap the things that we don't like? This may be a moment to remind ourselves what the Apostle Paul says when he's writing to the church in Rome. All have sinned and fallen short of God's standards. That's what he says. And because we recognize ourselves as having fallen short, we place our faith in Jesus. So, like I said, if God is going to uproot everything that's considered wrong and wicked, where does God draw the line? Because we are part and parcel of what is wrong in our world. And it seems to me that this is another point of the story. If we are to expect God to extend grace to us, then God's grace extends to everyone. And again, that's the whole foundation of our Christian message, that God's love extends to all. So, in a strange way, even when we see things that are wrong, even when we see the fruits of harmful intent of evil, the fact that it prevails is a reminder to us that we too are recipients of God's grace. And I know that doesn't solve everything, and I know it doesn't make our problems and our struggles go away, but we don't have to feel bewildered. We don't have to feel that God has abandoned us. And if we're struggling and we're finding things tough, that's when we need to know God's presence even more. So I think it's really important that we take what Jesus offers through this story. That when we see the equivalent of those malicious weeds growing in our harvest fields, yeah, we may well be frustrated and disappointed and hurting and overwhelmed, but it is not a sign that God has abandoned us. It is not a sign that our faith has somehow failed. It is not a sign that God's purposes are any less certain. And it is not a sign that our eternal hope is in any way in jeopardy. And secondly, I think it also seems to me that we're called to be a discerning people. Let me explain what I mean by that. If those weeds were going to remain in that field, and if that farmer was eventually going to have a decent crop, then the chances are that the field would need to be watered and irrigated and fed, and the farmer may well have added nutrients to the soil, and all of that investment that was going into enabling the intended crop to flourish would also have enabled the weeds to flourish. But Jesus is pretty clear. Those weeds are standing in the field, those weeds are flourishing and growing because an enemy put them there. And Jesus pretty unequivocally equates that enemy to the evil one. But those weeds were allowed to remain in the field because the owner was determined that his purposes were not going to be thwarted. They may have arrived in the field because of the work of the enemy, but they stayed in the field because the owner remained in control. And I think there's something of a challenge for us in that. We live in a world where the narrative is very often, if it's successful, it must be good. If it's popular, it must be right. And I sense that those kind of narratives can often find their way into our faith thinking too. We can very easily get drawn into the assumption that if it's successful, it must be of God. Well, let's remember that we're called to worship God, not worship success. And I'm not particularly saying that God doesn't sometimes give success, but like I said, the dynamics of this story suggest to us that it is not an assumption that we should automatically make. So just because it's flourishing doesn't mean that it's good. There was a lot of stuff flourishing in that particular field that really should not have been there. And that was an act of deliberate intent and harm. And it was not the fault of the weeds. It was the fault of the one who planted them. And the labourers in this field knew what they'd planted. They knew the difference between wheat and weeds. And I think we too need to learn to be a discerning people, not just assume that earthly success, even within our religious endeavours, is automatically a sign of God's approval. We need to be a people who can recognise what is of God and what is not. So we're called to be a patient people, we're called to be a discerning people, and thirdly, we are called to be a hopeful people. And by that, I don't just mean a people of blind optimism, but a people whose hope is rooted in the reality of the kingdom of God. A people who are able to judge reality on the basis of the values and the purposes and the timescales of God's kingdom. This field owner did not just shrug his shoulders in despair or indifference and say, well, you'll just have to leave them there. Nor did he shrug his shoulders and say, well, let's just hope for the best. His forward plan was not an admission of defeat. It was an anticipation of triumph. We will have a harvest, and when that harvest comes, we can happily uproot our crops, because by then they will have borne the fruit that we always intended. I put this crop in the ground with the very clear purpose of a harvest, and these weeds may make the scene look messy. They may stand as evidence of the forces that are at work against us. They may be the source of some frustration and anguish and even anger. But he invited his labourers to see them as something else too. Within the purposes of the landowner, their ongoing presence became a sign of hope that the harvest was coming. This is a moment when Jesus invited the whole of humanity to turn its theological eyes from looking backwards to looking forwards. Why is there evil in the world? Well, you can look back at the narratives of Genesis and what we call the fall, and you have your answer. You have your answer by looking back. But why is there still evil in the world after Jesus has accomplished salvation, when we've become part of what the New Testament calls a new creation? The answer requires us to look forward, because the day of the kingdom's full and final arrival has not yet arrived, but it is coming. They can stay here, he said, because we know what to do with them when the time is right to do it. And through this story, I would argue that Jesus invites us to look at our world with similar eyes. Whatever spoils the view in our equivalent of this harvest field may be signs to remind us that the forces of evil are at work in our world. But what they are not are signs that evil is victorious. They are not a sign that God is helpless in its face. They are not a sign that God's purposes have been thwarted. And I don't know how familiar the Apostle Paul was with this story when he wrote the book of Romans, but he captures this reality quite profoundly in another of the lectionary readings that are set for today, Romans chapter 8. I consider, he says, that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labour pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies, for in hope we were saved. So yes, there are times when creation will groan. There will be times when we will find ourselves groaning with it. And there are likely to be plenty of occasions when we find ourselves asking those searching questions that we find within the stanzas of those Old Testament Psalms. How long, Lord? How long? How long will the wicked be jubilant? And as we live in the midst of that reality, without diminishing any of the struggles and the trials that it will entail, Jesus has not left us without an answer. We can live as a people of patience because we recognise that same grace at work that assures us of our acceptance into God's kingdom. We can live as a people of discernment because we can recognise that not everything that flourishes is necessarily of God. And we can live as a people of hope, because the day will come when creation's groanings will come to their conclusion and the purposes of God will be fully revealed. And the great thing is this, that Jesus doesn't just leave us with an explanation. He promises to journey with us through this troubled world. And so we're going to have as our next song one that reminds us of that image of God as a shepherd. He will be with us. He will be at our side.